Too many writers fall into the trap of making structure their story god. Well, there's no denying that structure is important, but paying too much attention to structure can destroy your story. We've all seen movies and read novels that feel like paint-by-numbers creations. Sure, they hit all the marks and cover all the expected relationships, but they seem stilted, uninspired, contrived, and lifeless. The authors of such pedestrian fare are story mechanics. A story mechanic is a writer who constructs a story as if it were a machine. Starting with a blueprint, the writer gathers the necessary dramatic components, assembles the gears and pulleys, tightens all the structural nuts and bolts, and then tries to make the story interesting with a fancy paint job. But there's another kind of writer who creates a different kind of story. These story weavers begin with subjects or concepts about which they are passionate, and let the structure suggest itself from the material. They see their players as people before they consider them as characters. Events are happenings before they become plot. Values precede theme, and the story develops a world before it develops a genre. A book or a movie written by a story weaver is involving, riveting, and compelling. It captures the fullness of human emotion and captivates the mind as well. Well, although some writers are natural-born story weavers, there's still hope for the rest of us. In fact, you can become a story weaver just by practicing a few select techniques until they become second nature. So, first, clear your mind of any thoughts about characters, plot, and theme, and genre. Avoid any consideration of character arc, hero's journey, act, scene, sequences, beats, messages, premises, settings, atmosphere, and formulas. In short, don't give structure a second thought. Now, work to create a world in which people live and interact, things happen, meaning can be found, and the environment is intriguing. To do this, we'll progress through 4 different stages of story creation: inspiration, development, exposition, and storytelling. Stage 1, inspiration. Now, inspiration can come from many sources: a conversation overheard at a coffee shop, a newspaper article, or a personal experience, to name a few. And inspiration can also take many forms: a snippet of dialogue, a bit of action, a clever concept, and so on. But even if you can't think of a story idea to save your life, there are still a few things you can do to goose the muse. First of all, consider your creative time. Some people consistently find inspiration in the morning, others in the afternoon, evening, or even in the dead of night. Some people are more creative in the summer and can't write worth a darn in the other 3 seasons. And there are authors who work in cycles, and those who come with ideas in spurts. The key to using your creative time is to keep a log of your most fertile moments, and then plan ahead to keep that kind of time open for further inspirations. And don't neglect your creative space either. There are authors who go off to a mountain cabin to write. Some like lots of noise or babble, like a city street below their open window or an all-news station on the radio as background. There are writers who prefer a cluttered room because it engenders chaos, which leads to serendipity. And others who can't think a lick unless everything is orderly, neat, and in its place. Creative space includes the clothes you wear while writing. And there are those who wear hats when developing characters, and others who pantomime action sequences to get in the feel of it. Also, open yourself up to different kinds of writing media. If you only use a desktop computer, try a laptop, an organizer, a folding keyboard, longhand on a pad, or a digital voice recorder. And don't be afraid to switch around any of these from time to time and mood to mood. If you still can't come up with an idea, try the synthesis technique. In brief, you want to subject yourself to 2 disparate sources of inspiration. For example, just put a talk radio program on while reading a magazine or watching television with the sound down, and let the odd juxtaposition spur your notions. But finally, if all else fails, try using nonsense words. Just jot down 3 random words, such as red, ground, rover. Then write as many different explanations as you can for what that phrase might mean. For example, red ground rover might mean a red dog named Rover whose legs are so short his belly rubs on the ground. Might mean the Martian rover space vehicle on the red planet's surface. Or it might mean fresh hamburger made from dog, red ground rover. Well, your list might go on, but most of these potential meanings might be pure rubbish. And yet, occasionally, a good idea can serve us. If the first 3 words don't work, try 3 different ones. And in the end, even if you don't find an idea directly from your explanations of each nonsense word phrase, you'll have so stocked the creative spirit that you'll find yourself far more prone to inspiration you can use than before you started the exercise. Really breaks up the logjam. Well, use all of these inspiration techniques to come up with a log line for your story. A log line is simply a 1 or 2 sentence description of what your story is about in general. They're the same kind of short descriptions you'll find in TV guide listings or in your cable or satellite TV guide. A sample log line might be, the marshal in an old west town struggles to stop a gang who's bleeding the town dry. Well, with that in mind, let's move on to stage 2, development. Once you've been inspired enough to create a log line, you can move into the second stage of story weaving, development. And here's where you take your basic concept and flesh it out with lots more detail. In development, you'll begin to populate your story with people you might like to write about. Work out some of the things that will happen in your story, and establish the world or environment in which it all takes place. These efforts will ultimately result in your character's plot, theme, and genre. Now, there's many story weaving techniques for the development stage, but one of the most powerful is to project your world beyond what is specifically stated in the logline. As an example, let's use the logline we mentioned above. The marshal in an old west town struggles to stop a gang that is bleeding the town dry. Now, let's see how we can expand that to create a world and a whole group of people who grow out of the story, some of whom may ultimately become our characters. Well, the only specifically called for characters in that logline are the marshal and the gang. But you'd expect the gang to have a leader and the town to have a mayor. The marshal might also have a deputy, and if the town is being bled dry, then some businessmen and shopkeepers would be in order as well. Range a little wider now, and list some characters that aren't necessarily expected but wouldn't seem particularly out of place in such a story. For example, a saloon girl, a bartender, blacksmith, rancher, preacher, school teacher, etc. Now let yourself go a bit more and list a number of characters that would seem somewhat out of place but still easily explainable in such a story. Examples might be a troupe of traveling acrobats, Ulysses S. Grant, a Prussian duke, a bird watcher. Finally, pull out all the stops and list some completely inappropriate characters that would take a heap of explaining to your reader or audience if they showed up in that story. For example, Richard Nixon, Martians, or the ghost of Julius Caesar. Well, although you likely discard these characters, just the process of coming up with them can lead to new ideas and directions for your story. For example, the town marshal might be more interesting if he was a history buff, specifically reading about the Roman Empire. In his first run-in with the gang, he's knocked out cold with a concussion, and for the rest of the story he keeps imagining the ghost of Julius Caesar giving him unwanted advice. Well, the same kind of approach can be applied to your logline to generate the events that will happen in your story, the values that you'll explore, and the nature of your story's world, which will become your genre. So, we move on to stage 3 then, exposition. The third stage of story weaving is to lay out an exposition plan for your story. By the time you complete the development stage, you'll probably have a pretty good idea of what your story is about, but your audience knows nothing of it. Not yet. Not until you write down what you know. Of course, you could just write, my story's goal is to rid the town of the gang that is bleeding it dry. The marshal is the protagonist, and he ultimately succeeds, but at great personal cost. Sure, it's a story, but it's not a very interesting one. If you were to unfold your story in this perfunctory style, you'd have a complete story that felt just like that paint-by-numbers picture we encountered earlier. Part of what gives story life is the manner in which the story points are revealed, revisited throughout the story, played against each other, and blended together, much as a master painter will blend colors, edges, shapes, and shadows. As an example, let's create an exposition plan to reveal a story's goal. Sometimes the goal is spelled out right at the beginning, such as a meeting in which a general tells a special strike unit that terrorists have kidnapped a senator's daughter and they must rescue her. Other times, the goal is hidden behind an apparent goal. So if your story had used the scene described just a second ago, it might be that it was really just a cover story, and in fact the supposed daughter was actually an agent who was assigned to identify and kill a double agent working on the strike team sent to rescue her. Whoa. Goals can also be revealed slowly, such as in The Godfather, where it takes the entire film to realize that the goal is to keep the family alive by replacing the aging Don with a younger member of the family who can do the job for the next few years. Further, in The Godfather, as in many Alfred Hitchcock films, the goal is not nearly as important as the chase, or the inside information, or the thematic atmosphere, so don't feel obligated to elevate every story point to the same level. Let your imagination run wild. Jot down as many instances as come to mind in which the particular story point you're dealing with comes into play. Such events, moments, or scenarios enrich a story and add passion to a perfunctory telling of the tale. One of the best ways to do this is to consider how each story point might affect other story points. For example, each character sees the overall goal as a step in helping them accomplish their personal goals. So why not create a scenario where a character wistfully describes his personal goal to another character while sitting around a campfire? He can explain how the achievement of the overall story goal will help him get what he personally wants. An example of this is in the John Wayne classic movie The Searchers. John Wayne's character asks an old, mentally slow friend to help search for the missing girl. Finding the girl is the overall goal, but the friend has a personal goal. He tells Wayne he just wants a roof over his head and a rocking chair by the fire. This character sees his participation in the effort to achieve the goal as a means of obtaining something for which he has personally longed. Well, finally, stage 4, storytelling. By the time you've created an exposition plan for each story point you've worked on in the development phase, you'll have assembled a huge number of events, moments, and scenarios, and there's only one thing to do: tell your story. Storytelling is a multifaceted endeavor. It incorporates style, timing, blending of several story points into full-bodied scenes, sentence structure, grammar, vocabulary, and good old-fashioned charisma. Later on, in other tips, we'll explore a number of different storytelling techniques in great detail, but in this introduction to story weaving, I just want to address the primary storytelling problems every writer encounters: a passionless penetration or presentation of what otherwise would be an intriguing story. Story mechanics often get stuck at this point in story development. They're so taken with the perfect structure that they have created that they tend to anguish over the opening sentence and finally settling down to write the story never. Eventually, after writing and writhing with the problem for too long, they write one great line and become so intimidated by its grandeur they're afraid to write anything else lest it not measure up to the initial quality. Fact is, you're only as good as your own talent. Get over it. Don't grieve over every phase and try to make yourself look better than you are. Just spew out the words and get the story told. Something not up to snuff? That's what rewrites are for. Well, another common problem is the inability to let loose emotionally. Each of us is born a passionate human being, but we quickly learn that the world does not appreciate all our emotional expressions. In no time, we develop a whole bag of behaviors that don't truly reflect who we are, but they help us get by. Problem is, these false presentations of ourselves appear to be our real selves to everyone else. They cause others to give us presents we don't really want, drive us to make friendships with people we don't really like, and even marry people we don't really love. This false life we develop is a mask, but by no means is it always a well-fitting one. In fact, it chafes against the real us. The emotional irritation can be eliminated if we remove the mask, but then we might lose our jobs, our friends, our lovers, because they might find the actual people we really are to be totally strangers and not even somebody that they like. So instead, we just tighten the mask down so hard it becomes an exoskeleton, part of what we call ourselves. In fact, after a time, we forget we're even wearing a mask. We come to believe this is who we really are. So now, try getting in touch with your passionate self through that. The mask dampens any emotional energy we have, and our writing dribbles out like pablum. For the most riveting story, it becomes dulled by such storytelling. Want to really be passionate in your storytelling? Then try this. Lock the doors, take the phone off the hook, search for hidden video cameras, and then sit down to write. And for just one page, write about the one thing that you have of yourself that you're most afraid anyone else would ever find out. By writing about your most shameful or embarrassing trait or action, you'll tap right through that mask into the most powerful feelings. A gusher of passion will burst out of the hole.